afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Suburban Pathfinder. Recently, I have acquired a few now discontinued, obviously, models from Ontario Knife Company. Ontario is no longer going to be producing knives in New York State. I think the new owner is moving production down south somewhere, Virginia or North Carolina, but they're not going to be making knives in New York State anymore. And several of their knives are still available at clearance prices. Some of them, like this one, are factory seconds and can be had very, very cheap. And so I wanted to take a look. I haven't had a chance to start evaluating these at all, or certainly reviewing them. So I wanted to take a look at them while they still are absolutely brand new before I start beating on them forthwith. I am up at camp. This is a perfect time for me to be able to evaluate knives, beat them up a little bit, see how they hold up, and give you my thoughts. So the first one we're going to take a look at is this. This is the Ontario Spec Plus Alpha Combat. There were a couple of different knives also in the Spec Plus Alpha series. There was a Spec Plus Alpha Survival, which I think had a slightly shorter blade than this with a clip point as opposed to this trailing point. There was also a Spec Plus Alpha Machete, although it really wasn't much of a machete. It was more of a sharpened pry bar, but they called it a machete. Anyway, this is the Spec Plus Alpha Combat. It has, I think, a 6.5-inch blade. I don't have a tape measure here, unfortunately. The blade is fairly thick. It's at least 1/8 of an inch thick. It might be more like 3/16. It's made from 1075, so kind of a medium carbon steel. Heat treated relatively soft. I think these are 53 to 55 Rockwell, something like that. So basically a spring temper. It should be an extremely tough blade, although the tip itself is kind of fine. So we're going to try not to whack on that too much. I won't be hammering this into logs and doing snap out tests or anything like that. The handle on this is supposed to be Craton, but unlike a lot of the other Spec Plus series knives, which had a very soft and grippy rubber Craton, this is a much, much harder compound. It is grippy. I think when you have wet hands or sweaty hands or bloody hands or whatever, you're still going to get a good grip on this. It is a little bit tacky, but it's much, much harder than that soft, gummy Craton that's on most of the Spec Plus knives. So it does have this trailing point with a bit of a swedge ground onto it. It's nowhere near a false edge. You would have a very, very hard time sharpening that. It would take you some time with a grinder. The rest of the blade has a flat saber grind. The flat actually comes out quite far. The saber grind is only maybe, I don't know, 2/3 of an inch or something wide. And in typical Ontario fashion, it had an awful, awful secondary grind. Very, very steep. The inclusive grind was probably 90 degrees. So I had to reprofile the edge significantly. You can see how much I had to grind away there. But all in all, I think this is going to be a very tough field knife. Again, it's called the Spec Plus Alpha Combat. It looks more like a butcher's knife than anything to me. One of the defining characteristics of the Spec Plus Alpha series was this grip. I've already said it's fairly hard, rubbery compound, but it has a very, I don't know how to describe it other than a kitchen knife look to it, but it feels very good in the hand. No obvious hot spots. This feels like a handle that you could work with pretty much all day without getting blisters. I really like it. I don't know why this series was not more successful. So anyway, we're going to take it out and really wail on this a little bit. Many of Ontario's field knives had a sort of baked on epoxy finish or some sort of powder coat finish. This is actually a phosphate finish, so we'll see how that holds up. But I'm thinking as long as I can avoid hitting the very tip of this with my baton, this looks like a very, very tough knife indeed. And although I did have to reprofile the edge, it took a fairly good edge. And I can see this being effective at making feather sticks. you can kind of choke up on the blade a little bit, although there's no fingered choil or anything there. It is a bit blade heavy. It should be pretty decent for chopping. Maybe I'll add a pinky lanyard on here before I start doing any chopping. But I think this is a pretty good looking knife as far as field use. It's a bit thick due to this really wide flat and the relatively steep and narrow flat saber grind. I don't know that it's going to be very good for slicing tasks like food preparation or anything. But in all other ways, it should be pretty good at the general run of camp tasks. I don't need to do any testing of the knife, however, to tell you that the sheath that this comes with is absolute crap. The knife itself is well worth, I think Chicago Knife Works was blowing these things out for like 19 bucks. The knife is well worth the money, I think. We'll see. What is definitely not up to par is this sheath. So it's all made out of nylon. It does have a hard plastic liner, which is nice. I like that. I think this sheath is actually a pretty good storage case. It's good for transporting the knife. But if you think you're going to wear this thing on your belt and carry this knife in the field, I want to tell you that you're sorely mistaken, because the straps on this are just awful. You have to kind of very carefully snake the knife into the sheath, wiggle it back and forth. You've got to hold this strap out of the way, because there's a very, very good risk of slicing this particular retainer strap right off, and it's made out of thin, flimsy material. So you got to kind of work the knife into the sheath, snap it closed. It does have good retention. And as I said, this is probably not a bad transporting case. You could toss this in a backpack or something. And if you're not worried about actually carrying this thing on your belt, you could probably get by with it. But if I decide that I really like this knife, which I suspect I might, I'm definitely going to make a Kydex sheath for this, because this carrying system is completely unacceptable. So now I'm going to go beat on this thing a little bit, and I'll come back to you with my thoughts. So a few days have gone by, and I've had a couple of sessions outdoors with the Ontario Spec Plus Alpha Combat, and I had kind of mixed results with it. My first observation is that I was a little bit incredulous initially about this knife being called the Spec Plus Alpha Combat, because it looks more like a butcher's knife than anything. I can confirm, after my very first session outdoors with this knife, that this very, very fine, very, very pointy tip is extremely efficient. I inadvertently stabbed myself in the hello finger, and the knife went in pretty deep, and copious quantities of blood came out. So, and I've been going through Band-Aids and antibiotic ointment ever since. So, if your intention for buying this knife, or the reason you're looking into it, is sort of pokey, stabby purposes, I can wholeheartedly endorse this knife. Now, as far as its use as a field knife, or a bushcraft knife, or a survival knife, I had sort of mixed results. I started off doing some batoning, and I was working with extremely hard, very seasoned white birch firewood, and it's extremely hard and very, very tough. Now, the Spec Plus Alpha bit into the wood readily, and its rather steep, flat saber grind allowed it to split the wood fairly efficiently, but I do feel that it's a bit short for doing any serious batoning. I was basically busting up some kindling. It does have this very fine spindly tip, and no doubt I hit that with the baton several times, and it didn't snap or bend or anything like that. But I don't think this is really ideally suited to that sort of bushcraft task. Then I decided I was going to try to do a little bit of chopping. I did add a pinky lanyard on here to give myself a little bit of extra length. But chopping anything sizable with this is pretty difficult. The blade design is sort of weight forward, and if this knife was bigger and you could get a full grip on the handle, you probably could do some pretty decent chopping with this. As it was very difficult using the pinky lanyard and sort of choked back grip to control the knife effectively. A lot of my chops weren't going in square, and it just doesn't work very well. You could, certainly in a pinch, in a survival situation, you can cut kindling to length or something like that, but it's not an ideal chopper. It's not a very effective hatchet. I also did a little bit of feather sticking. Certainly you can raise some curls. You can make shavings to get a fire started, but right now the edge geometry on this is still too steep to really get nice curls going. So it's probably actually a pretty good combat knife. It's not really good at the broad range of bushcraft tasks. I imagine as a survival knife it would work fairly well. You certainly could get by with this knife in a survival situation, but if you're like a bushcraft hobbyist, I don't think this is a good choice for you. The phosphate coating on this is extremely coarse, very, very crystalline, and you can see there was a lot of transfer of wood material to the blade. What that tells us is there's a lot of friction with this knife going down through when you're batoning. So unlike some of my other knives that have some kind of baked on enamel finish, which is generally a lot smoother than this really does fight you quite a bit when it's going down through the wood. Now, of course, phosphate's not super durable. Eventually this is going to wear off and you're going to end up with a bare steel blade. But since the finish is already messed up now, and since we've determined that this is not going to make a very good chopper, it doesn't work well as a hatchet, I think the next step is to see if we can make it work better as a knife. So I'm going to put this on a slack belt grinder once I get home and see if I can further lower the angle of the final edge and see if we can at least get this into a better slicer and cutter. I think for $19 for essentially more knife money, I don't see how you could go very far wrong with this. Once again, this sheath is absolute trash, other than as a transporting case, other than as a carrying case, but you're not going to put the knife in and out of here on a regular basis without using two hands, and therefore it's absolutely useless on your belt. But if I can improve this edge geometry and get this knife to slice a little bit better, I'm definitely going to be making a Kydex sheath for this. And I think this could actually be a pretty good field/survival knife. I don't know if it's ever going to be my go-to favorite, but I could definitely see this living in the center console of my truck or underneath the seat or something like that. So if I find myself in a desperate situation, I've got a decent knife with me, and if somebody steals it out of my truck, I'm going to be out $19. So I guess that's pretty much all I have to say about the Ontario Spec Plus Alpha Combat. So I think it's about time I got working on the next video, and when I post that up, I hope to see each of you then. Later, guys.